On the album Black on Both Sides, Mos Def said that people talk about hip hop like it's a giant living on the hillsides coming down to visit the townspeople. And he goes on to say, we are hip hop. So hip hop's going where we're going, and hip hop is doing what we're doing. So, to my mind, that's a little bit like policy. Policy is going where we're going, and policy is doing what we're doing. Policy is not created from an ivory tower and from the top down, but rather is something that people have to organize to get to. So, how do we marry these, sort of the tensions between the unusual bedfellows of organizers and researchers? And how does what role does research play inside of movement? What challenges and barriers might it, bring up? And what are some examples of times where there's been successes, in those ways?
Is that all right? Okay. So walk with me for a while. I'm a bit of a nerd, and I'm gonna get to this. So one of my favorite things, I'm a big Marvel and DC comic fan. Yes. And one of my favorite characters, superheroes, is Batman. And I was like, we're here. Okay. And why am I talking about Batman where I got a question about research and policy?
You got a question about Mos Def.
Yes, and most stuff. So one of the things that I love about Batman, if you ever see him in the context of the Justice League, is that like all of the rest of the superheroes who have a massive amount of power are all like afraid of him, right? They're all like, I don't know how he does it, right? And it is because he's a detective, and that detectiveness is the research, right? He is at his core somebody who does a lot of pre-work, and that makes him one of the most baddest ass superheroes there is with actually no superpowers. And that's how I think about research on our work. It is the thing that we can do to like enlighten. It says it highlights the issues that we are having. It sheds light. It's a thing to start a conversation, but it's also what arms us when we are trying to do policy that is effective. It is the thing that we can point to because so oftentimes in our communities, we talk about facts and figures, and the data. I always like, show me the data. And I really love data, even though I think it's only part of the story. And research gives us those pieces. So some of the examples that I can think of are how data has been helpful in the work that I've done before. I think of two examples that come to mind. One, I had started a conversation. It ended up in a group chat, then went into a podcast that we were just like, I wonder where men are on abortion access. And we kept having that conversation. I guess I should have also introduced the work that I do. I'll do that in a second. And so that then turned in some polling information, and we polled men of color and to say, hey, where are you on abortion access? And unsurprisingly, they were with us. There was very little convincing that we needed to do. But what we also saw in that polling information is that they also asked or said, well, we don't know how to get into this conversation, and we kind of needed to be invited in, right? They thought their support was standing on the sidelines, being like, letting women's like lead, quote unquote, right? And so we invited them into that conversation. And we just came back off of our Hill Day. And in this Hill Day, we had almost 70 to 80 men of color on the Hill talking about abortion access. And they were deeply like in it. They wanted to have the conversations. They were able to talk about their own abortion access. And with that, we were also able to get those conversations and a conversation with the White House because we were able to show the data. We were saying, hey, men of color really care about these issues, but nobody's talking to them. Hey, also, we see that you have an issue with men of color and voting. So this is actually a good conversation to start. And those pieces were incredibly helpful for us in the pieces in being able to platform or have a conversation. The second piece I would say quickly is that one of the work that I love to do in policy is trying to put together something that is both bold and courageous, but also passable, right? And one of the things that we always do is look at what is popping, not only in our other states, not only in our country, but in other countries of what's gotten passed, what's looked like, what are these things that are super helpful that us learn from. And we put together different pieces of policies, like all right now has two pieces, Abortion Justice Act and Age Act, that we were able to introduce. And then in my past life, we were able to put some maternal health pieces of legislation together that got all the way through and passed because we were able to learn from the best of other states and pull those pieces together to get some of the best pieces of policy that we could. And so data and research, learning the information, highlighting what's important, what are issues that you might not be seeing, what are issues that might come up, are incredibly important to doing effective policy.
My organization, Jobs to Move America, we're a policy advocacy think tank that uses grassroots organizing to create good jobs and green manufacturing. So we put it all together. Like, the truth is, you can't make any progress if you don't put them together. So how you started off talking about, we are policy, we're policy, we go where policy go, we go. Like, that's the truth. Like, I think what happens is sometimes when we're in movement work, we forget the very intimate integration of, base building, organizing as something that guides policy. And I think the most effective policy that we have seen are ones that are rooted into real grassroots issues that have been identified on the ground, lifted up, put into the fancy language, and then sent back to us to kind of advocate for, right? And I think the disconnect happens is when, like you said, you make policy in a room and you do research and tell people what they need instead of being informed of what it is that people feel they need. And then developing policy outside of that, I think that, we have to figure out how do we keep it connected and keep it on the same line, because what happens is when you deviate from what the needs of the people are, then you get lost in the sauce. And so research informs everything. We can't even go into a place until we have some type of intel or recon about what it is we're going into. So I think a lot of organizations in the community fall short because they're really good at mobilizing, but they don't have the research capacity. And if you don't have the research capacity, you really don't know how to study what you're up against, and you don't know how to name the thing to create the language to be able to position it, to actually take it to a place of policy. And so we have to really understand that it's a very intimate relationship. Research opened the door for organizing. Organizing opened the door for policy. Policy opened doors for change. And so those are the rules that needs to be put in place for us to have a better society. And when I say research, like, I'm talking about the labor space. I've been union organizing for, over 20 years now. And every conversation we have with a worker is research and recon. We're trying to understand what is their issue in the workplace. What is their story? How do you, what is the world that they would like to envision for themselves? How do you get there? Then we assess them. That's quantitative metrics. That's all research. And so we have to really be thoughtful about, what is research and how does it inform our ability to move forward to actually get the proper language for the policy that we really need to see so we get the change that we need, and then working our way back, keeping the people connected every step of the way, because we don't want to create policy in a vacuum and then give it to the people, okay, now go and fight for this. Like, what are you talking about? Okay, I'm sorry, I went on a rant. Yeah.
When you all are thinking, what was kept coming up for me was a really concrete example around the marriage equality fight, because that fight was driven. That was not a fight that the LGBT advocacy community picked. It was one that the right wing picked with us, right? But then now it's on the blocks and we have to fight for it. And the advocacy was driven so much by the messaging research and the message discipline that the movement was able to coordinate on. And then when the case finally went in front of the Supreme Court, one of the main questions that they had to weigh was, has there been a sea change in public opinion on the issue? And that was driven by the research-driven messaging that had, in fact, changed hearts and minds of the movable middle. So I think that's like really, when I think about the marriage of research and policy and organizing, that is, one of the top things that comes to mind. But that actually brings me to another piece, is that, oftentimes in organizing, you'll hear, people say that nothing without us is for us. But research, is necessarily a distance, from the what is being studied, because you have to, have a certain amount of rigor in that. And there's a difference between advocacy and research. And I think that sometimes that's where we get a little, to your point of lost in the sauce. We hear people say things like, people vote against their interests. And actually, we just don't have the research to know what their interests are. Like we need to dig further, because actually people, they don't vote against their interests. We just don't know exactly what the thing is that they're prioritizing. So when I'm thinking about it, there has been like mistrust of researchers. Like, we don't necessarily answer pollsters. Most of us don't even answer our phones anymore. Like, you know what I mean? Like, a lot of research and data has been skewed because of lack of trust between the subject matter and the researchers, pollsters, like academics, what have you. Some of that is a product of historical patterns of extraction and exploitation. But I guess the question that I have is, how can we be data driven with what our work requires and be grounded in the research and the hard data that comes back, while also understanding that our role in the movement is to cultivate a radical imagination about what is possible that is not bound by the data and the current realities and the conditions that we're in.
Yeah, when you first said that, like, nothing without us is for us, my eyes popped out. Because, like, we're talking about research and policy, right? And the truth is, without us, it can't be one. Like, Black people and women historically are not in those research opportunities. They're not in those policy-making spaces. So, like, if a poller, I'm in North Birmingham, 75% Black city, hood, and some, truth is, some white kid from Brown coming knocking on my door, asking me how do I feel about X, Y, and Z. Like, are you a social worker? Are you trying to take my kids today? Like, we can't trust you because I don't know you and you don't even book. Like, this is a pipeline situation. We have to figure out, how do we create a more diverse space at the point of entry, for people of color, for women to get in these spaces more. I think less for women. Women typically are in these thought spaces, and but the people who would probably benefit from this change the most are the people who are typically not in those positions to actually drive the research efforts, drive the policy, tell the stories. And I think that's a disconnect. So it's like, how can we trust research if we're not even allowed in those spaces? And I'm a hybrid. I'm an organizer, researcher, but in my career has always been, Erica's most effective mobilizing people, and disregard my mind and my mental capacity. And so I feel blocked out of research spaces where I know I'm competent and capable of doing the work. I mean, in grad school, I was a top student in my program, graduating, and I was an excellent technical writer. But there's a perception that Black women can't write. We might not write in the European standard style that everyone expects that you're teaching at these PWI institutions. I come from an HBCU, so it's like, we have to be open-minded about what research looks like. And it's an art form, and it's a creativity effort, and it's like, research comes in all types of ways. And so we just have to open our minds to, like, really shift the paradigm on who is considered a researcher, who's considered a policymaker, and then let those people be in those spaces, but just empower those people to be in those spaces so that they could go and build their own voice in this body of knowledge.
I would add to that, our Women's March managing director, who is just one of the smartest humans I've ever met, always says that we have to honor our different ways of knowing.
Yes.
So, like, it doesn't have to be in a lab or in a controlled poll or what have you for us to be conducting research and for us to know things and to research.
Yeah, I would just add, when Erica said study, That is what I think of when research. It is the study, right? So yes, that could be your quantitative and qualitative that you're doing, your focus groups, right? And your research and your polling and your message testing. And it also could be the studying. One of the things that I think I really want us to get a better muscle for is actually the rigor of doing the work of figuring out what our folks want and need, what our opposition is, what are all the pieces on the board. There is this saying that I heard when I was doing a fellowship about progressives loves to bring a data book to a knife fight. And we do.
My life is flat from eyes. Someone said.
Yes. So, and it's also like, it's a dance between the knife fight and the data book, right? But it's also understanding what type of fight that we are in, and then looking and getting the type of information that we need. What I see, and one of the things that I've been really like just kind of sitting on, right? And I'll give an example is that like a lot of folks now are like, well, how do we talk to just like folks of color and young people? The economy is doing so well. We just need to
totally going to ask you to give this one.
Yeah, it's just doing so well, right? And I don't understand why they're just not happy because look, and I'm just like, well, what are we measuring? Because if you are measuring the stock market, right, that's not what young people's day to day is. That is not my day to day, right? I'm looking at gas prices. I'm looking at the price of childcare. I'm looking at the price of food. And in that day to day, I'm actually not feeling that, right? And so it is also a question of what we measure and how we measure it and who's in the room to ask those questions. So it is just important when we're thinking about how we engage in the conversation about data is the questions that we ask, but also what are we measuring? What is the value of the measuring of the evaluation? Because that's also a problem that we don't do, right? So if we care about people's happiness and wellness, but we only measure the economic and if you have a job, there's a disconnect that is happening, right? Which is how we're missing things. And then I think to the point of like what sometimes we're missing are like what things that we should remember. Dr. Ruha Benjamin is a professor out of Princeton and she's brilliant. And I still conversations from her all the time. But there's two pieces I want to raise here. One, she has the idea of the conversation of who's asking the questions, but also that sometimes we have a tendency to ask folks to understand science, but not our scientists to understand ethics and morals. And what does that mean if we are asking the folks who are doing the research, the kind of the more institutionalized research, to actually have that type of ethic and moral and community service and framework into those conversations. And we don't do that very often, right? The community, we just need to push science. But what does it mean to have those conversations about morality? What are the ethics? How do you go into things? What are people feeling? And so I wanted to raise that. And then the second piece, she also said about how dreaming is a practice, that we have to be like, it is a strategy. And that if the future that we are in, right, is one that somebody dreamed up, it could be our worst nightmares. And so our strategies and how we move the work, it is also deeply important for us to use dreaming as a strategy, as in forecasting as a strategy, futurism as a strategy, because that is how we know where we are trying to go. And how do we then use the evaluation techniques to evaluate where we are going from the dream, not from where we are right now? How do we evaluate the things that we want to have than where we are right now? It's also a piece that I would add.
Oh, I love that, Nourbese. Did you probably like a kind of tag on this one? So, like, to your point about like asking the right questions, or like how do we get the right answers to a vision and like meet a vision that we need? We partnered with Alabama A&M. Thank you, Pop, for helping us on that. To get the holistic story. So we look at manufacturing and industry. So all the old instruments and tools around economic development are pretty one-sided. And like, it doesn't really nail down or drill down all the human experience of those jobs. So then the numbers are like super top level. So it like kind of say your restaurant industry, they throw the chefs, the waiters, the waitresses, the hostess into the same pot. But those are completely different jobs within that space, right? So think about, manufacturing and industry work like that. Like you say that it's so many jobs and these are the better paying jobs, but like you don't look at the frontline worker, which is the majority of the people that go in there like getting injuries and all kinds of stuff. And what is your definition of a good job? So we partnered with Alabama A&M and then later on Jackson State University to come up with a manufacturing report to actually give a holistic story about a Southern manufacturing worker, asking them what was it like to access those jobs? What does it feel like to work in manufacturing? Like, so we have this, the quantitative data, clearly, that's the easy part to get. Like, but then we started questioning like Toyota and, Goodyear and New Fly, like these big corporations, like the professor who led that research ended up going to England just to get away from the smoke. Like, it was so dangerous because it was so powerful, the findings of that report, and it gave a whole experience. So to your first question, like, was there a victory? Like, and this so powerful, it's very difficult to organize in the South. We got workers who are now, forming unions because of it. Like, it's really powerful, like, to understand what it's like to go and do a thing every day. Like, those are the issues that you identify that help people figure out their future. So you can't find childcare. You get forced overtime. So what does a future look like for you? I need help with childcare. I need resources to have childcare, or I would not like to have overtime. That's an easy future to actually accomplish, and you come up with the tools to actually make that happen. So it's like having those stories with the data. So like you said, data to a gunfight. Like, yeah, I'm gonna need some data and I'm gonna need some stories, and then we're gonna have a whole picture, and then we can fight.
I love that analogy. I was just making notes here about what was coming up for me, just listening for you all talking. And one of the people that I'm lucky enough to be close to is, and she would call herself an organizer, but she's also had a long career in academia, Barbara Smith, who led the, Combahee River Collective Statement and is, one of the foremothers of Black feminism. And one of the things that, I have talked with her about with, her cohort, is that there were groups of organizers who then she's taught at, a lot of different schools, and so is her sister. And so her best friend led the undergraduate program that I was in Wisconsin in the African American Studies Department. So there was an era where organizers would become academics. And then, of course, necessarily because of how schools go, you're in a publisher parish, you're going to do research, and move into that. And I wonder about the tension there, because I think that research, like when you think about the purpose of research, and what you're trying to do, you have a hypothesis and you're trying to prove the hypothesis or not. There's a certain amount of rigor and objectivity that you have to hold, and you're talking about creating an accurate outcome and landscape versus changing conditions, which is the role of, organizing and advocates. And so change moves at the speed of trust. And so we know as organizers, to your point of like some stranger who's not in the community comes knocking at your door and says, do you, something about your kids, you'd be like, And so I think the question that I'm sitting with here is, if we're looking, is there an ecosystem that we can build or a feedback loop that we can build? What does the ecosystem look like when organizers are working with researchers, inside and outside of the, traditional academic type of research, where we're working to meet the community need, and also holding our rigor around the research that is being, research and policy that's being developed as a result.
Yeah, I mean, I think,
And sidebar,
yes.
because I just feel like tossing you a curveball. Is there a tension between researchers moving into a role of almost organizing by virtue of the power that they hold inside of, institutions in academia, and saying, for example, it's very rare that as a mobilizer, I go into any space that I don't hear about Erica Chenoweth's study, where if you move 3% of the population, that change necessarily happens, right? And, they themselves have kind of modified that statement, but like what happens when the ecosystem is out of balance in one way or another, where, it's like, well, prove your data, prove your research, prove all of these things, and you can, it's hard for us to demonstrate because we're moving trust, we're moving conditions that aren't necessarily always quantifiable.
Okay, where to start? I think one of the pieces to your last point is thinking about how do we deal with folks who are, or what does it mean to actually be in good partnership? And I say this because what came up for me are two pieces. One, I remember a time where, I was working at a grassroots organization. I took all my little pennies together, and there was not a lot. And we put together some research about, at this time, it was like environmental toxins. It was something really important to us. And we did it, and we tried to get other funding for it. And folks are like, oh, well, you guys, we're not as sophisticated enough, right? Our little grassroots organization wasn't sophisticated enough. So we get it, we put it out. And then another organization, another university came in and decided to do a study on our work to see how effective it was. And they got like $300,000. And I was like, okay. So they also did not ask us. So I'm sitting in a room where all of a sudden I see that they took one of the pieces of literature that we did, made copies of it, like on a whatever the Xerox. Yeah, I was like, I know there's another word for Xerox copies, but I can't think of it. But they Xeroxed it, and they're like asking the community what they felt about it, and did not feel any way about it, because for me, what it felt like, community organizations, and particularly one that was led by Black women, was in service of, like, we're supposed to give our stuff away, right? That is, that's what community organizations do. And of course, we're not sophisticated enough to get this big research piece that they found actually really great results on, right? But we're able to do, we're just there to kind of like almost lift the work of other folks, right? And I remember trying to have a conversation with the university about how disrespectful it was, but also like, if I did that as a student of this university in California, and copied somebody else's work, I would get kicked out of school, particularly without letting them know. And there was a conversation that we needed to have with our IRB process, right? Like, come on, y'all. Like, if community work is not descending on community, and then like saying like, ooh, this looks really interesting, let me take their work, but what is it that we need? And so when I think about partnerships, I think that is the blueprint of like, how we can actually do some really good data, some really good studying, get us the information that we need in order to drive the work. But it is actually in trusted partnerships. It is not the kind of descending on organizations and grassroots organizations. So I think that's the first piece. Will say that there are other spaces that we've been able to do some great work in partnerships with folks. I've seen great work in partnerships with organizations and research organizations that came in and was like, what are the questions that you need to answer in order to pass this thing? What are the questions that are incredibly important for the community in order for you to drive your work forward? And some of those like pieces of information, very similar to what Erica was talking about, we were able to like shine a light because those are the stories. It's stories in that data, right? That we could say like, hey, this is what's happening in our communities, and this is what we need in order to solve those pieces. But I guess to really emphasize, if we're really wanting to think about that connection, it is how do we be in deep, trusting, authentic relationships and knowing if you are the folks with power in that space, how to come in. That doesn't mean to like disseminate your power. We need some folks to have power, but how to use that in service and with folks that you are working on behalf of.
Yeah, I totally appreciate that. I think this question, I alluded to it like at the very beginning, like, you know, y'all seem like some pretty dope people here. Y'all want key policy researchy people, but real spill, like, it's super elite. It has an elitist culture. I think in these spaces, we tend to, you know, like, bring minds together and inspire each other and kind of teach each other their trades. But I feel like it needs to be said, like, for her not to get funded and then turn around and give a whole nother group $300,000 because she wasn't good enough. Like, stuff like that just chaps my goat. So this is the thing. It has to be accessible. And I think about me and my partner, my current partner, Madeline Janice. I love her. We think about air game and ground game. In order to win a battle, you have to be able to have both tactics, like shored up and water game. Okay? So the water, I say the water game where our partners, our funding partners, they're the water game. They make their money float. Okay, so, but no, the ground game is, you know, the battle tactics used to like kind of, you know, move the program on the floor. But that air game is like, what are the existing rules? What are the existing, you know, opportunities? What are the leverage points? What are the big questions, right? And then somehow they have to marry each other and communicate with each other. And I think being in planning and in cahoots from the inception of the idea for both air game and ground game to always be discussed at the same time is critical. Every campaign I've ever, you know, worked on that was successful, we had our organizers and researchers in the room together, like coming up with, you know, tactics. And it was fun putting together our war chest or however you want to talk about it. But to your point of like, is there tension of researchers becoming organizers? I don't think so. I think the tension is organizers going into research because organizers are more likely younger, you know, people of color, probably younger, you know, Black women, you know, those types of people who are really effective mobilizing. And then that's all you've been known for is mobilization. And then when you say, okay, but actually, I want to write a report on X, Y, and Z, and they be like, you know, right? You haven't looked at my writing, you haven't given me an opportunity to write. But I think it's easier for a researcher to move into organizing because they're the ones that kind of help set the strategy with their research because it's informed decision making. So they have a leg up. And so when a researcher decides they want to become an organizer, now they're a strategic campaigner. They'll never be called an organizer. But if an organizer decides they want to become a researcher and they manage to break into that space, they're organizer.
And I think where it gets muddy is like, I mean, when we think about researchers, we also think about academics, but I'm thinking about the failure of big data and the failure of polls.
2016, I get flashbacks. Lord.
That part. You know, the failure of big data where folks legitimately thought big data can replace organizers. And
it cannot.
Yeah, and the results were like, you thought. So I know we have one more question here, and we're also tight on time. So I wanted to challenge us to think about one thing that organizers and advocates do. A lot of what we've been talking about here is like communities of color, you know, and people inside of communities who are engaged in the act of organizing, not as an intellectual pursuit, but as a way by which to change the conditions so that we can survive and live and thrive. And a lot of that is invisible labor. I always tell people, you know, we do these big mobilizations and, you know, we end up behind these podiums, but I'm like, you know, when you think about where history is made, it's the people, you know, in the bus boycotts that literally walked holes in their shoes. Or like, if anybody here is around from Boston, I was shook when I went to Boston because you can go all around Boston and see Paul Revere's work. He was a silversmith, and his work is still all over Boston. But we know him for the Midnight Ride, you know, which is essentially his volunteer work, you know. And you never know when it's the right envelope that you're stuffing or when you're walking the thing. You just never know where a tipping point happens. So I think, you know, the question that I'm talking about, I believe you said, like, how do we shine a light? Like, so in this invisible work that we do that actually is the what moves mountains, how do we shine a light on that? And then on the other side of that, what do folks in research and policy partners need to understand about the nuances of our work in order for them to, you know, do their big one and to penetrate silos and for us to like come together like Voltron? And we've got 1 minute each to do it, and then we're going to go to Q&A.
I just say true partnership through and through. We riding together. We in the same car. At no point when you on a road trip, somebody get out and start walking beside meet you there. They don't. So we in this thing together. So we cannot ever separate. We got to be in the same car all the way through. We just have different functions. I'm gonna navigate. You're gonna do. I got hot Cheetos in the back seat, passing them up, and I'm driving. You know, everyone has a function, and we can never collapse the function and then come back together and meet at the end and say, okay, now let's go and do this play. We got to be there every step of the way together.
Yeah, and what I would also say is that, and I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but like, how do we also make sure that that invisible labor is honored? How do we make sure that we are naming our partners out loud? A lot of times I see like the community organizations that we work with, and I guess I should do my little All Above All is a abortion justice organization that works to make abortion affordable, available, and accessible to all. We are a networked organization, which means we have partners all over the country. And all the time I've seen partner organizations that are working and doing like the Lord's work, and essentially lifting mountains. And they're too busy to tell their own stories because they are too much doing the work. And so that is, I feel like one of my big jobs is to tell their stories, to make sure that we are inviting them into the room, to make sure that like when someone's like, well, we're having a fancy dinner, and I'll be like, you know who should be there? This person back here who did all this work, and this is why we are able to do and move our work forward. And so I think if we are thinking about it, how do we make that invisible later? How do we honor it? And how do we make sure that the people who are doing the work are seen for that work, for that could build their capacity and resources as well?
And we, I think, are officially transitioned into the Q&A section. And like, shout out to y'all for taking the curveballs, because as you were answering ahead into my questions. And so I'm like, okay, now we're definitely freestyling. So we were up here on variations on a theme. Yes.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Star de los Santos, Associate Director at Women Employed. And I love data. I'm definitely a data nerd. But I work with a lot of people of the community and family leaders. And, we know political jargon, research jargon, it's a lot. It's a lot for us to understand. So just thinking about what are some ways that, you all or we all can help make this research a little bit more digestible for the community. Because we know we've seen it on the other side, especially 2016, how people take data, manipulate it, you know, and take it to and use it for bad, you know, and to really like, you know, get people to hate and to be divided and stuff. So yeah, so like what are some ways that we can like, you know, take this data and really make it digestible for the community so they could really fully understand it in a good way to make these political decisions?
I mean, as a person who interfaces as an organizer more than I do a researcher, when I'm in these policy strategy sessions and research strategy sessions to develop language and stuff, and we move something into capital, like I tell my team, like, if a third grader can't read, it ain't no good.
That part.
Like, I'm gonna need you. If I don't get it, they definitely ain't gonna get it. So I kind of serve as a translator. Like, first of all, I'm gonna need a one pager. I need a summary because, yeah, like they take 150 pages to do something that you can sum up in one page. Okay, the rule is we need to roll back local hire. Wow, it took 240 pages to say that, but I'm not gonna read that because I'm a busy organizer. So like making it palatable, just talking regular, get away from the jargon and figure out how do we say this in a way that people can understand that this is something that you raised as an issue and you want to improve. And we're just taking what you said and we're turning it into a rule. We're trying to get it passed as a rule so it could be the land of the law. That's it. Keep it KIT, keep it simple.
And if you can't do that, you don't understand it well enough. I remember doing my graduate research, and my advisor, I put my little graduate, she said, think harder. And I don't know about your experience, but we used to have like a word limit. If we were turning in a policy memo, if it was more than 750 words, you had to revise it. And so like keep it simple, keep it non-jargony, but like you also have to make sure you understand it. You know what I mean? And a lot of times that might be the part that we a little shaky on.
We ain't do it right then.
Yeah.
So I was my undergrad, I was a journalist major, which I think helped me so much in my job because journalism teaches you how to tell somebody else what the thing that's important. And so it was translating, but also thinking of, and this is other research, of like how people consume information, right? Social math, right? Things of like saying 1 out of 3 people. We can imagine that in our brains, right? And making it so that folks can have and use all their senses if possible. And when we're trying to describe what that is, so it engages folks in different ways, right? Because some people are like really good at like understanding something if you put it on a slide. Some other folks are really good if you like need to put it in an infographic, right? Some other folks need to hear it. Some folks might need to see it, right? And so using all those pieces to like engage all the senses. I think the other piece that I also learned is like I try to also take our research and turn it into play.
Mm-hmm.
So what do I mean by that? Like we usually, like I use games and things that actually move your body in the room in order for us to really talk about those issues. And so how do we then say there's a thing on, or I was trying to talk to folks around, again, environmental toxins. And so we just actually like brought up a game, had a different scenario, talked to that, and then talked through what that research was, but made it plain. We made it plain in a way that wasn't quote unquote, like, I don't want to say like dumbing down because our communities are brilliant, right? But made it in a way that people can like apply it to their lives right then and there, and then be able to then regurgitate that, right? And talk to other people about it, which is, I feel like one of the points of research is to be able not to hold on to it, but it's to be able to like tell the story that we need to tell.
Thank you. I'm Liana Kassar. I work with Oasis, which is a program of family values at work. And there are 2 things that are coming to mind for me. One is centering, right? That so much of the data that we are given sort of centers, or at least so from being in a policymaker space, it centers the money, or it centers the agency, or it centers the service, and how frequently we are in policy discussions as a result of the way data is presented, housing units, right? But we're not centering people. And so this constant need to like take the data that we're given and just try and make sure that we keep coming back to the people, because I think it's used against us when we're not centered. And then the other thing that I'm thinking a lot about is just emerging programs. In part because I happen to be running an emergent program, but I also see all of these wonderful pilot efforts and pilot policies. But then how do we do research on those? Because so often we have some really great pilot, we got a whole bunch of great people, and then after a year or two, or the bill or appropriation ends. Yeah, we did that once in 2016, but we can't learn from it and bring it back to inform better policy. So any thoughts on those?
I know that very well in the terms of the last piece of it. I remember when I was in California, I worked on a data piece that we were expanding abortion access. We're like, yeah, we did it. And then we never circled back to actually see if it expanded abortion access. And so one of the pieces that we have to build into our policy work, into the research work, is the circling back. So one of the things that I try to do when we're thinking of new pieces of legislation, and particularly if it's a pilot, of like, okay, what happens after 3 years that we then force us to come back to look at this data and jig whatever we need to jingle and then move forward. I think the other piece that I've been sitting with a lot around language is in our attempt to be the most, for lack of a better word, politically appropriate, we have a tendency to dehumanize. So what do I mean by that? So we've turned to using the word unhoused. Folks know what unhoused, yeah. One of the things that we do in that is take out the picture of a person that is homeless, right? And so we also need to think about in our language, how do we also make sure that we're still being the best that we can be in terms of giving humanity, but not dehumanizing people in the research.
Yeah, and I think when we're like building out policies that might lead to like programmatic moves or shifts like that, I think thinking about impact assessments and there's funders or somebody that's in this room investing in impact assessment. Like we do all this work to get this policy passed or these rules updated, and then we don't circle back. So in our work, we're constantly thinking about how do we measure success, like beyond just the win. Because I think when we get to the win, a lot of people are like, oh, we done with that. I so enjoy it, and that's about it. But I think the real work actually starts at the implementation. And so when you're thinking about your implementation strategy, whether it's 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, there should be checkpoints within that where you're circling back and just looking at, okay, where were we first came to this piece of work? And then what we actually won, where were we at? And what immediate gains were we able to make? And then over time, what does that look like? And if then, and you moving, then you might want to circle back around and make sure that you got to the core of the issue that you were working on in the first place. Or if you just doing policies for policy's sake. I mean, I think we do get caught up in that too, like moving rules just to be moving rules. Like, oh, we'll do this year. Oh, we're gonna do it. But no,
I'm thinking widgets.
There's issues that are brought from the people, and so if you don't see any movement, then what have we done?
I agree. And especially on the heavy on the water are measurements, because for me at Women's March, everyone always says, how many people were at the DC March? And I'm like, I understand that this is the visual. I understand how media works. I'm not answering this as a complete rube, but at the time, I'm so much more interested in the march in Enid, Oklahoma, or Arkansas, or Arizona, where they're having ballot initiatives or whatever. What are the places in which it takes real political courage? And I'm not saying that, the DC marches are not, they're important. They're an important show of political power, and they help us to expand, the people in the movement. But the impact doesn't necessarily flow from that. That is a tactic to get to impact, but it's not impact itself. So when we're talking about 10,000 people, that's an input. That's not an output. So we have to start thinking it really sharply about what is the output of that, the political education, and then what do those people do later, so that we're really being rigorous. And the second thing that I would say, and I got our wrap motion here, but I know that we're all probably here to vibe afterwards, is who funds research feels really important to me. Or Women's March has 3 vehicles. One is a C4, one is a C3, and one is a super PAC. Our C4 is funded by the people at an average dollar donation of $15. We as an organization have been able to weather many storms. And what this brings up for me, and a question that we ask inside of our organization all the time, is who in this mobilization, in this initiative, who are we accountable to? And who funds you becomes very central to the question of who you are accountable to. And so if you're accountable to the people at $15 per, that is a completely different type of accountability than if you are funded by one donor or a number of major donors or things like that who have very specific interests in wanting to see blueberry pies made. And it will, it will bring work into certain alignments. So I think it's really important for us to think about those pieces, the just having some rigor about the who and the what and the when of funding, measurements, and how we are both funding, driving, and measuring success. And I want to say thank you for all the curveballs up here.
One last thing.
Yeah.
It'll be super quick. 2016, there's like, oh, the polling was wrong and the data was wrong. I think it's the questions that were wrong. That's it.
Yeah.
The questions and maybe like who was asking them,
Who was they asking and how were they asking it? So sometimes people be thinking that it's the method is the data, but sometimes it's the people.
And then people were like, no, because they were shy Trump supporters. What MAGA you have ever met is shy? They're out there with their big ass. You know what I'm saying?
So we will wrap on that. Thank you all.
Yes.
Let's not do that again.
Yes. I would say one thing though, on the topic of 2016, 2024, there is a fumble in the moment, which is to say Project 2025 is a 1,000-page document of policy and research. And look how it's backfiring as a political tool, and like it has opened them up to, it has opened them up to critique in ways that they have not been open, precisely because they have mismanaged the messaging, the data, and how that research was presented. Because ain't nobody reading 1,000 pages. Our edits, our condensed version is 30 pages. I didn't even read that.
They should have did that to the Alabama Constitution.
Thank you all for coming, and we're happy to chat.